I want you to take a little walk with me across paddocks planted with the current season crop. And in your mind you have pictured a shining sun, crisp, fresh air, and with only the aroma of the rich, fertile soil disturbed just from your footsteps. It is peaceful and it is relaxing. You are imagining a place that you know best, a place that is surreal, and that place has a piece of your heart. This walk you just took with me, I'm but just a little girl, that's so bad, who grew up in the 80s and 90s to parents who were true Australian farmers. And this paddock we just walked across is owned by my parents, George and Pam Bender of Chinchilla. I grew up learning that I was living in a lucky country, that Australia was the fortunate and that opportunities were endless and abound, and the only concern that I had to worry about was to obtain an education. And so the journey begins. As a little girl with so much wealth, not wealth obtained through greed or through violating the rights of others, but deeper wealth, wealth that money cannot buy. Wealth of living in the country that they called Australia. And as a little girl, I dreamed of vibrant colours, of drawing and painting, of pretty textiles and creating fashion fit for Hollywood superstars, or of just becoming a world-leading veterinarian. My grade 8 science teacher said, or Mr. Ballicott, he declared to my parents, Helen can be whatever she wants to be. She just has to put her mind to it. So I made my choice, and I found myself graduating from university in a male-dominated course with an honours degree in engineering. So it is with my mind that I put to the current issues that will bankrupt this lucky country, steal her of her wealth, and destroy the rights of all Australians. The system that has worked to silence our basic right as human or animal to clean food, air, water, and shelter. This is not a journey of how did we fall asleep, but are we awake to the violations of our basic human rights? We all have that special place in our hearts, and for one man, George, it was Chinchilla that had a firm grip on his heart. And understanding the importance of this one location, this small town in Chinchilla, in Queensland, could be his entire world, where he stood to protect his rights for both now and for the future. And so, like the roots of an old oak tree, they ran deep, deeper than what we could ever imagine. But the journey starts 142 years ago, when George's great-grandparents on his mother's side, the Turners, settled in Chinchilla, while the Benders arrived in Chinchilla a short 109 years ago. In 1907, John George Bender, this is George's grandfather, he was one of the first businessmen in Chinchilla. So those roots grew deeper into the soils of Hopeland when Lawrence George Bender married Florence Turner. These are George's parents, and in 1940 purchased a property in Hopeland named Valencia. 11 out of 17 of Florence's grandchildren completed their primary education at the Hopeland State Primary School, all with the surname Bender. Plus, of course, there was George and John, the generation before. I was the last Bender to walk through those school doors, and I now stand here to speak on behalf of my father, George. But during those early settlement days, Chinchilla was in the heart of the prickly pear infestation. The land around this area in places were impenetrable, and this battle against this nature took decades to get under control. Now, farmers know and understand how to battle with nature, with floods, with droughts, with plagues, and such battles are a fact of life when your heart leads you to become a farmer for your country. I tried to picture this town that I have known all my life covered in prickly pear of impenetrable portions. And in my research, I learnt that there were only a few people in Chinchilla during the height of the problem who believed that the pear could be beaten, and there were many skeptics who thought otherwise. So I asked myself, is history repeating? Is the gas well prickly pear of the 21st century? And are there only a few of us who believe that this noxious weed can be eradicated? But what did it take to eradicate the prickly pear? In 1839, the cactus was introduced from Texas as a pot plant. By 1901, 4 million hectares were infested with the prickly pear. The following years saw rewards being offered for a solution. By 1920, the prickly pear was spreading at a rate of 400,000 hectares per annum, now at over 24 million hectares of land infested. That would represent about 14% of Queensland. There were more efforts, more experiments, failure after failure. 1926 saw the cactus blasts with the release of 2 million eggs near Chinchilla. By 31-32, the cactus blast's grub was recognised as a sure destroyer of the prickly pear. So this timeline nears on a century, but it seemed it was more of a war that extended over 4 decades. But the importance is that the people never gave up. And we too must never give up. We must keep trying, we must keep doing new experiments, new angles, new people. We must never tire, we must never let go, we must never look back and only forward, and keep our aim on the prize to eradicate the 21st century prickly pear, the gas well. And of course, George's family, they helped in this fight. They were here in the region. And it gave this region its chance that it has now. Something else that I learnt, in 1909, an extract from a selector's diary. Now, a selector is an immigrant from England who took up a selection of land not far from Chinchilla and was faced with the prickly pear and land clearing. And I read these words and I thought how we could use these words today. Considered myself and the family trapped on the property deliberately by the government, as it should have known. The conditions imposed were worse than slavery and impossible to be accomplished, and any small area would not have been sufficient to make a living on, according to market value of commodities. So what did I learn? That the government are as ignorant now as they were back in 1909. It is believed the name Hopeland was coined from the phrase, the land of hope and glory, which to the early settlers considered reflected their aspirations for the future. Hopeland, as we know her today, is at serious risk of losing all that hope and glory, stolen by the short-term aspirations of multinational corporations. What will be the future of Hopeland? What will be left of her glory? What will remain of her hope if we are to keep silent? The property Valencia within Hopeland holds tales of pastoralism and perseverance, of stories of drama and struggle, and her soils are drenched in the blood, sweat and tears from each of her masters. Transforming her from a property of scrub and prickly pear, unable to support life, to a property that now supports millions of lives from the crops reaped each year. Every tale and story, every drop of blood, every bead of sweat and every trail of tears, all include a character by the name of George. His roots ran deep in the soils of Chinchilla, along with his heart, and that is why he stood his ground. But discovery is always an exciting time. In 1844, the existence of coal in the district was discovered along the regions of Charlies Creek. By 1915, Warra saw the first production coal mine. Gas was found at Brigalow in 1928, but not sufficient to be commercial. But it wasn't the gas that was being explored, it was oil. And over the years, many companies tried to find their luck for the black gold within the district. The discovery of gas was found as more farmers commenced water drilling operations within the Brigalow and Warra regions. In September 1945, the local press reported that a new bore had been sunk near Brigalow. It had a flow of natural gas of a pressure believed to be greatly in excess of that of any other bore in the Chinchilla district. It was struck at a depth of about 100 metres. 3 samples of the gas was taken for analysis purposes, but the pressure of the gas was such that a 12 stone or about a 56 kg man sitting on a kerosene tin was unable to sit on the bore and being lifted off in seconds by the pressure. At the same time, a Hopeland farmer by N. Bullock's bore and other bores in Hopeland had also gas with high methane content. Tests showed that the gas contained about 85% methane, and it was believed locally at least that it would be suitable for use in a power station. In 1947, the year George was born, the Department of Mines announced that the gas was not suitable for commercial application and nothing would come of this possibility until 2005. Enter QGC. Now this is George Bender's story against the gas industry, but there is no other person in the world who could tell it better than him himself, so I'd like to share the stage with George.
George Bender from St Helen is a district here. It's about 22 k's southeast of Chinchilla.
So landowners within the district have been considered by the government and the industry to be within the zone of sacrifice, thus enabling the rollout of extractive industries. In 2005, the district of Chinchilla was covered in a veil of silence as the unconventional gas industry crept into town, and with it, every basic right was sacrificed. Basic rights belong to everyone, either human rights or the simplest of landowners' rights, or the imperative environmental rights. These basic rights have what we have come to expect in this country. It is often the case that this public debate between people versus unconventional gas, we see the overlapping of these basic rights. Clean water, air, food, shelter, these are all elements that have their relevance across the basic rights for all humans and animals and the environment. Now, George Bender was just one landholder who stood his ground and his rights, his human rights, his property rights, and for environmental and animal rights. The list of real impacts due to CSG is extensive, and in combination it has the potential to change our way of life. And for some of us within the zone of sacrifice, life will never be the same again. We can already see the permanent damage that has already been done.
They don't really care how they treat you, really, as long as they, like one representative of the company said, look, if you get a negative effect of CSG, well, so be it, cop it, and move forward.
For a landowner such as George, the battle with the gas companies starts at the property boundary, their property rights, and the conflict between what is imposed by legislation and what is a landowner's right under common law. The rights that is generally accepted in common law is that a landowner has the absolute right to determine who enters the land and who remains on the land. And in doing so, the landowner essentially enjoys the right to exclude any person from entering the land. The power of a landholder it has been established under the case of Plenty versus Dillon. This is where in law it has been confirmed that a landowner has the right to exclude others from entering the land as a trespasser. So this is what we call trespass law. A landowner's right to control who enters the land has been altered by statute under all jurisdictions in Australia, granting the Crown the right to reserve ownership and control over petroleum and minerals. So now we're in the situation where the state of Queensland hold Crown rights over the coal seam gas under our land. And Section 26 and 27 of the Petroleum and Gas Act basically states this, that the petroleum is the property of the state and that the Crown basically has exclusive rights to undertake petroleum activities. So this means that under this system, there is this situation that has allowed separate interests to be held over a single property. And this concept known as fragmentation property rights means that a land can be owned by a farmer as a freehold interest, yet entitle a petroleum company to hold a title that allows it to enter the property to search for resources. So while on one hand we have a trespass law under common law, protecting the rights of a landowner, on the other we have a government who are legislating in opposition to just basic property rights. So what went wrong? There was this real concerted effort to deceive the landowner via the deceptive rumour that there was no right to say no to access to this industry, no right to veto to any activity on your land, via the myth that a farmer just owns the topsoil. Correction, a landowner holds the title to the land. There is no measurement to the depth of that ownership. So this simple right to say no by a landowner requires some serious amendments to be made to our current government policies and regulations that impact and affect access to private land. And these sections in the Act that require a landowner to engage in compulsory negotiation with resource companies. This compulsory negotiation inflicts such a disparity in power upon a certain segment of the community. And this term compulsory removes our right to freedom and ownership. It forces society to cross from democracy into some sort of capitalism. So in order to restore the basic property right, we need to establish those conditions for fair commercial negotiations. And the importance of that right to say no, to be able to express that an offer is not a commercially viable contract, will provide some control and return of power back to the landowner to enter into negotiations based on a true commercial basis without any fear of intimidation tactics, bullying or threats. Currently, the manner of the negotiations is best described by George.
I just reckon it's all one-sided for the resource companies.
And of course the time has come.
I really think it's about time the government got their acts together and said, look, if a farmer doesn't want coal seam gas on his wells on his property, that's it, go.
There have been years of pressure applied to the government for this change, as the current laws are failing to prevent resource companies from walking over the top of farmers. As I stand here today, we are still in that same battle to implement change with legislation to grant fair and reasonable balance during a compulsory negotiation stage. But the right to access is just the start. It really does seem as if the government doesn't care about the farmers' interests at all.
The governments, I don't care which one it is, they don't really care. They make out they care about agriculture.
In keeping with the landowner's rights, but let's just step through the gates of access to review the rights of a landowner within their titled boundary. Surely a landowner who is forced into compulsory negotiation would then be granted fair and reasonable rights within their property lines. Should a landowner be entitled to have the right to say where activities occur within their property boundary or not? A ruling that has allowed advanced activities 200 metres from your home is a legislation that will remove amenity from your home, and it will allow a very noisy, dusty, poisonous gas activities only 200 metres from your home.
So we're living in a gas field, it's simple as that. And actually the government now is going to allow companies to put gas wells within 200 metres of residence. Now that's just stupidity. No common sense in that decision whatsoever.
A more frightening situation is obviously where a resource company is allowed to enter onto a property while a case is being heard in the land courts without any conditions in place. A company does not have to wait for a ruling by the land court prior to accessing a property to undertake their activities. Is this fair and is this reasonable? Possibly it's fair and is reasonable as a resource company that requires no agreement to undertake preliminary activities across your entire property. George had both QGC and Origin undertake preliminary activities across Chinta. Where is the rights for landowners in this situation? Or the resource companies to pay fully all reasonable professional fees, but only if the landowner agrees to sign. And as to what is considered reasonable is obviously a point of much contention, but currently the Queensland Resource Council and APIA are currently lobbying for the government to propose a cap to those professional fees. So while one party has a team of expertise, advisors, a full blown out professional team, a landowner is only allowed legal, accounting and valuation. So watch out if you need expertise outside of basic accounting, which we had to also get advice on because it's complex. Or you need an expert consultant on hydrology or some environmental issue. And let's also not forget that the GST component will not be paid by the resource companies. Yeah. So landowners are limited in the expert advice that they can actually receive. So frequently landowners do not have the financial capacity to pay for the expertise needed to be properly and fully informed. Are landowners entitled to a right to negotiate based on being fully informed? Is it a right in Australia to make decisions based on facts as opposed to assumptions? It is important to remember that any signed agreement goes onto the title deed, so this binds all successors to that agreement. This is a very important agreement that is done under the circumstances of a lack of choice and a lack of control. No choice, no control. Is that not the same as having no rights? There is no protection in legislation or requirement by regulation for compensation for the devaluation of a property. So this is even made more difficult for landowners who have no activities on their property, but yet are surrounded by gas activities. Properties are becoming unsaleable, and the only option may be for an absentee landowner who might be interested in purchasing. Is this not a right that has been taken away? The inability to sell a piece of land due to the activities of another, activities that the government has legislated to be compulsory. What about the landowner's time? Why are landowners not being compensated to be paid for their time?
Two full days a week dealing with the EHB or the companies or the coal seam gas companies and all that. It's just...
Yeah, so one party is not paid for their time, leaving the door open for the industry to waste time and to deal unfairly. Who has the right to determine what your time is worth to your business?
Like with this paddock we're looking behind here, in Arrow tenement, this paddock here could have wells every 750 metres with roads and all interconnecting the wells, and look, that would just absolutely you just couldn't farm it. So if the government's allowed that to happen, the fellow might as well just walk off the land and say, right, have it.
By August 2006, the Chinchilla News wrote, Chinchilla cotton grower George Bender received a compensation agreement but has refused to sign it. He was much happier planting cotton, wheat, barley, sorghum back in the days before QGC entered his life. Furthermore, property owners have either given up the fight or, like Mr. Bender, decided that there was nothing to lose by taking on QGC. And the Chinchilla News was right. So many landowners signed, so many sold up, and so many didn't even start the fight against the industry. George was reported as saying, a couple of times I said I was going to give up, and then I said, no, I'm not. So 1 year on, George is now describing the industry as an unscrupulous and environmentally damaging gas extraction process. The sheer size of these LNG projects, a blind Freddie could see that the projects will have massive environmental impacts. And the realisation that the government has chose to proceed without knowing what those impacts could be, or even tried to understand them, is distressing. And this puts into question both the human and the environmental rights surrounding this industry.
This bore here that I'm standing next to is in the immediate affected area. It's in the balloon coal measures, and it's prediction to have a drawdown of about 95 metres in the immediate term. So that means that this bore here will have no water in it within 2 years' time, and the companies have got to make good. They've got to find you an alternative water supply, or they've got to do something. So there's 85 bores that are in this immediate affected area, in the balloon coal measures, that are going to be have no water within 2 to 3 years. Then after that, in the long term, as the industry ramps up and they get more and more wells down, there's another 520, over 500 bores in that long-term affected area that won't have any water either. So as far as the underground water goes, people relying on the water from the Walloon coal measures, they're going to be without water.
So as people gained more knowledge and concerns were shifted towards the impacts to the underground water, in 2010, the industry made numerous claims that the CSG industry do not take water from the Great Artesian. The claim was not part of the Great Artesian Basin. However, the Walloon coal measure was already identified by the Queensland Government Water Resource Operations Plan as being an aquifer of the Great Artesian Basin in February 2007, 3 years prior. The Queensland Resource Council then tells the Queensland Country Life that coal seam gas companies are careful not to take the Great Artesian Basin water. How did the Queensland Resource Council come to this conclusion? It was a simple twist of the words. This is what they said. The Great Artesian Basin is not a coal seam. So, coal seam gas companies will not be seeking to draw down water from the Great Artesian Basin. The impacts to groundwater are being ignored. And the coal seam gas companies were using a legislative loophole to avoid reporting on the impacts of their drilling on groundwater levels. The government moves to set in trigger thresholds, but what this really meant is that the industry could still take all the water they wanted. They just had to provide a few amendments to the Water Act 2000, and the government started to fund a bit of a research into the groundwater impacts. It was the water that kept George Bender in this battle. And as farmers across the state started having bore issues, the industry was using every excuse to point the blame somewhere else. The loss to access of clean, reliable bore water is a straight-out violation of a landowner's property right. It is also a violation of human and animal rights and environmental rights. On the 17th of May 2012, the first draft underground water impact report was released. This is where George learnt that 2 of the 3 water-stocked domestic bores on Chinta were within the immediate impacted, meaning that the trigger threshold of 5 metre drop would occur within the first 3 years, a total drop of 95 metres and 105 metres to each of his bore. The third bore was impacted in the long term, meaning after 5 years, this would render his property waterless. Just due to coal seam gas activities, landowners lose their rights to, lose their allocation rights to water.
This bore here, it's on the property, it's an asset, and if they're taking it away from you, the government doesn't seem to worry about that. All they think about is getting the gas, and that's it.
So what options were available to George? There were no aquifers above the Walloon coal measure, otherwise that would have been tapped into initially. The only other option was to go to a deeper aquifer within the Great Artesian Basin, like maybe the Hutton sandstone. But such option was actually not open to him due to the Water Resource or the Great Artesian Basin Plan of 2006, which restricted further developments of most of the aquifers in the Great Artesian Basin. So, under current Queensland legislation, the PNG Act, the Petroleum and Gas Act, overrides all the water planning legislation, meaning the industry is able to take and interfere with the water. Surely the Petroleum and Gas Act, the Water Act, and any water planning were meant to work together as opposed to being in opposition. The underground water issue is a true failure on the Queensland Government. It should have known these facts before the industry, prior to its approval. The modelling of the impacts prior to it commencing, and establishing obviously a network of groundwater monitoring stations as a condition on the approval before any production could commence. This would have been proactive and it would have been smart, but no, the Queensland Government operate under an adaptive management framework, meaning we will respond after we see a problem. The ability of the resource companies to have unlimited water take comes at the expense of all other water users. The industry is bragging about jobs and royalties, and the government is on a high, but it should not have been at the expense of existing landowners who are entitled to a permanent water supply. Can a replacement supply ever be provided? I don't think we know. George is now in negotiations with Origin Energy for a make good agreement for the loss of his water bores, a battle that took the ultimate toll.
And the government let them get away with this sort of thing. The Act says they must have completed the make good agreement 100 days after the report was done, but the companies just keep going back to the government to get extensions. Now, I'd like to be playing this game by the same rules, because if a landholder, when we get to CCA agreements, if the landholder has got 40 days to agree, and if he doesn't agree to that, he doesn't get no extension to keep it negotiating. You've got to agree to their terms or else.
Or else. Now briefly, if a water bore is affected by the activities of coal seam gas, and the tenure holder is required to enter into that make good agreement with the owner of the bore, there is that designated time frame, which George said was 100 days, it's the 60 days plus the 40 days. However, resource companies were requesting the government and were granted extensions of time. These extensions were given without any reference or any notification to the landowner. This is exactly what happened to George. A 100 business day negotiation period became a 555 business day contract time. In addition, if a landowner had a bore that was able to be expanded and they were relying on this expansion for their business, such as increasing the size of their feedlot or just putting more cattle onto the property, a make good agreement will only be limited to the existing use, not the future use that was the right of the landowner. So eventually the impacts of the gas activities will determine the fate of future generations' access to underground water. And as farmers are called upon to increase their productivity, the coal seam gas industry will either lock producers into present production at best, or more likely decrease production. So clearly the rights of landowners are not being protected at any stage, as one bore after the next will be negatively impacted by coal seam gas and the depressurisation of the Great Artesian Basin. This is what will happen to water bores. They will turn into kicking fountains. This unfortunately happened a month after George's funeral. This is basically the gas that's migrated, have found before pressure is pushing the water to the surface. George also stood on the banks of the Condamine River and reported to Four Corners that he had never seen the river bubbling like this before.
Old-timers like George Bender have never seen anything like it.
Never seen it before.
And other farmers in the area have seen it?
All the other farmers have never seen it like that before.
So is it natural then?
Well, if it was natural, wouldn't it be there all the time?
And George was absolutely correct, as the methane had found a natural fault line to the river, meaning if the bubbling was natural, it would have been doing this all the time. What we are witnessing with the Condamine bubbling is the depressurisation of the Great Artesian Basin and the dewatering of the Walloon coal measures, yet the industry has really yet to come clean on this. There is a real risk that landowners will also lose their riparian rights as the dewatering of the Great Artesian Basin will cause serious environmental harm to the Condamine River. What we are seeing is property and environmental rights overlapping. What is also of great concern to landowners is the exposure to future liabilities, especially surrounding food quality standards. There is no insurance to protect the livestock industry against contamination by chemicals that are not approved to be used in agriculture. Yet it is up to the landowner to sign that National Vendors Declaration, declaring that their livestock is free from contaminants. Neither the government nor the industry will indemnify the landowner from this high risk. Why? Because it's a high risk. Biosecurity and weeds. The industry are able to negate any possible liability originating from their operations by simply supplying a weed certificate. What this system means is that the industry is able to set up and self-regulate their liability without any independence at all. So where does this leave the farmer when faced with a biosecurity risk, weeds, or an outbreak and something like foot and mouth disease? For landowners who are on strategic cropping land or good quality agricultural land, the government have set up loopholes. Any protection that could have been applied to protect prime agricultural land was not applied retrospectively. So any petroleum lease that was granted before the 13th of June 2014 was exempt from the strategic cropping laws.
Yeah, you've got a well 750 metres. Now you've got a, we'll say, 300 hectare paddock cultivation. You've got to plant it and spray it. And it just makes it'll make it impossible. Well, it won't make it impossible, but it'll be just downright very, very hard, because they'll have all these roads, wells joined up. They'll be joined up with gravel roads, and they're not in a straight line. And nowadays, all the machinery is all GPS. It's all auto steer, and set on. You'll have everything set on 2 metre centres or 3 metre centres. It'll just completely interfere with the running of the property. But that doesn't seem to matter. As long as they get wells in and get the gas out of the ground, that's what matters. In actual fact, we said to the company, well, look, how about moving some of these wells? And they just said, oh, well, look, you'll lose too much gas. We'll lose too much gas, so they just have to go there.
So Valencia, the property that George lived his entire life on, is now in the middle of a 320 square kilometre excavation caution zone. This is an area that landowners are not able to dig more than 2 metres without first contacting the government. Link Energy were provided with approval for a pilot trial underground coal gasification plant located in Hopeland, an experiment that ended them being awarded with the title of becoming Queensland's largest environmental disaster in history. But strange things started to happen or occur years before the government started investigating into the world's best practice and the most highly regulated industry. It was George who started to speak up about his concerns, and he was first to publicly do so. By June 2011, Peter Bond, Link Energy CEO, who's in court today, wanted to shut George Bender up with an alternative agreement with a 7,500 air conditioning unit. George refused the agreement. Peter Bond immediately threatens George with legal notice to shut up or be shut up. What did Bond not want George to share? The health impacts that were being experienced included an odour that could wake you from the deepest sleep, burn your eyes, and made breathing difficult. Plus, there was impacts to the livestock. Animals had difficulty breathing, eye issues, and a high number of deaths, including issues that we saw to wildlife, especially birds. As in any good farmer, you undertake your own investigations and autopsies, and the vet disclosed that whatever is killing the livestock will kill humans too. It is an environmental issue. This one might be difficult to hear, but we'll see.
No, animal health. I don't pig, I know that I've had a pig all my life. And there's some things that have happened that I've never seen happen before. Seems always stuff like this. Well, you go down and feed your pigs in the morning, come back half an hour later, here they are gasping for breath. And they just go like that. Heart attack. It is, they go through a heart attack.
That was George at the Senate inquiry in 2014 explaining the health impacts to his pigs.
To me, it's like underground coal gasification. It shouldn't be anywhere near prime agricultural country. Well, actually, to my way of thinking, it shouldn't be allowed anywhere. It just shouldn't be allowed. It's not a very nice industry to be around. Right, because after a couple of years we used to cop a terrible odour from that plant. First it was denied by Link themselves, but it was proved that the odour that we experienced did come from there.
So in February 2015, Link Energy was committed to trial on 5 criminal charges of environmental damage. Landowners in Hopeland are now living in an excavation caution zone with carbon monoxide, hydrogen and hydrogen sulfide lurking underneath. It is more than just environmental harm, and yet the government are involved in this complete violation of all human and animal rights to our clean air, water, food. The final consequences of this disaster is yet to be witnessed, and we are left in a position of
Continue with the investigations and wait and see.
And we wait and see if the government will continue to allow the same contaminated soils to be drilled by the coal seam gas companies. Now, having roots that run deep in the soils surrounding Chinchilla, the truth is there are not many people who can truly understand the full impacts on oneself and what it takes to continuously stand your ground and your rights.
Well, can't keep it out of your mind. It's, you know, you just can't keep it, you're thinking about it just about all day, every day sometimes.
For one man, upon receiving a letter from Origin Energy giving only 30 days to sell the property under their terms and conditions, with the alternative of being threatened into a forced conduct and compensation agreement, CCA, whereby after 20 business day negotiation period, either party can apply to a land court. And we have just learnt earlier that once in land court, all control over access is lost to the landowner. This is the sort of bullying tactics that are used against landowners who are standing by their rights. It is especially important for the people who are supporting any landowner in similar battles to understand the difference between mental illness and psychiatric injury. The symptoms are very different, yet the outcome can be very much the same. A mental illness is internal to someone, you won't understand the reasons. Psychiatric injury is external to the body, you know what is causing the problem. Someone or something is liable. So to conclude, this is what George has to say about the company.
We've got a saying out here now that we call them liars, cheats and thieves.
I add murderers. When landowners are forced to accept such agreements with a gun to their head, it is clear breach of every human right and therefore falls within the external powers of the components of the Constitution, Articles 10 and 12 of the International Declaration of Human Rights, and they're very relevant. And they are, everyone is entitled to a full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal, and no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with their privacy, family, home or correspondence.
You might sometimes say, oh, let's go. But where would you go? To find a better country? Probably you just wouldn't do it.
And as a little girl, I grew up learning from this man that I was in the lucky country. And his forefathers fought for this land, as did George, and so must I. His death is a symbol of the denial of justice and the violations of all basic rights. I got to the last sentence. Okay, I'll do it. His death is a symbol of the denial of justice and for the violations of all basic rights as landowners, as a human, as animal, or the environment. And we must continue to stay awake to such violations of our rights and remember that there are skeptics in everyone, but so long as it's not in you. Thank you.